The Architect, the Siiren, and the Crime that Defined a New America. Forget everything you think you know about the polite, proper, and buttoned-up history of America's elite. This is not a tale of reserved social calls and hushed drawing-room whispers. This is a story of $700 million fortunes, 17-year-old sirens, and a very public, bloody murder. A scandal so lurid, so dripping with the excesses of a newborn aristocracy, that it became known instantly as the crime of the century, defining an age when the nation was finally rich enough to be truly decadent. It begins not in a smoky back alley or a frontier saloon, but at the very pinnacle of American achievement, the rooftop garden of Madison Square Garden, a palace of pleasure and architecture designed by one of the most brilliant and arrogant men of his time, Stanford White. It was June 25, 1806, a sweltering Monday night in New York. The city was in the throes of the Gilded Age, an era roughly 1870 to 1900, where the old reserved bard of the Astors and the Vanderbilts was battling the furious rise of new money, a time of unprecedented fortunes built on railroads, steel, and oil. Society was electric, frantic, and teetering on a fault line of excess.
On that glittering rooftop, a place where the wealthiest men of the city met to sip champagne and eye the chorus girls, two men sat at separate tables. One was the architect of the place itself, Stanford White, a man with a booming laugh, a reputation for exquisite taste, and an even more notorious reputation for his Red Room apartment, a secret lair for private, often dubious entertainments. White was the de facto artistic king of New York, the man who had sculpted the city's aspirations into limestone and marble, from the Washington Square Arch to the stunning mansions along Fifth Avenue. He was the personification of Gilded Age genius and its moral slipperiness. The other man was Harry Kendall Thaw, a Pittsburgh millionaire, scion of a staggering railway fortune, but perpetually overshadowed and dismissed by New York's elite. Thaw was wealthy beyond measure, yet dangerously unstable, prone to violent rages and debilitating bouts of paranoia. His obsession was also the final, vital piece of this deadly triangle, a young woman named Evelyn Nesbit.
The Siren and the Secret. Evelyn Nesbit was, by all accounts, the original It Girl. Born in 1884, she was a stunning red-haired beauty whose face and figure graced countless magazine covers, postcards, and advertisements, making her the most photographed woman in America. At just 16, an age that society winked at while exploiting, she was plucked from the chorus line and introduced to Stanford White. White, in his mid-40s and married to a respectable socialite, was instantly smitten, initiating a relationship that, by modern standards, was explicitly predatory. He became her Svengali, moving her into his private apartment and showering her with gifts and promises. The key, and the darkest secret of the entire tragedy, was what transpired in that infamous Red Room, an opulent, mirrored space with velvet ropes and a velvet swing, a detail that scandalized a nation not yet ready for the news. Evelyn would later testify during the trials that followed that White had given her champagne until she passed out, and she awoke to the knowledge of a profound violation. The affair ended, and Evelyn moved on, marrying the troubled, possessive Harry Thaw in 1905. Thaw was obsessed with both Evelyn and the idea of rescuing her from the clutches of the corrupt New York architect. Crucially, Thaw had been driven mad not just by jealousy, but by Evelyn's horrifying recounting of the Red Room incident. He saw himself as a chivalrous hero, the champion of a maiden soiled by the satanic White.
The night the music stopped. Back on the Madison Square Garden rooftop, the air was thick with smoke, cheap perfume, and the faint, sweet sounds of a light opera being performed in the theater below. White was dining with friends, enjoying a successful evening. Harry Thaw, however, was hunting. He had Evelyn with him, a fact that in itself was a deliberate provocation, dragging his fragile wife back to the scene of her first ruinous seduction. At 11 p.m., the opera concluded with "Tell Me, Pretty Maiden." As the final applause faded and the orchestra struck up a popular ragtime tune, Thaw rose from his table, his eyes fixed on Stanford White, who was laughing heartily at a joke. Thaw walked rapidly to White's table, pulling a small revolver from his coat. The crowd, accustomed to the drunken antics of the Gilded Age elite, didn't immediately react until the first shot rang out.
"You ruined my wife," Thaw screamed, a sound that cut through the music and the laughter. "You will pay for this, you SOB." Bang! 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 3 shots found their mark. Stanford White collapsed onto the table, his blood quickly blooming on his immaculate linen shirt and soaking into the plush rug of his own architectural triumph. The crowd erupted into pandemonium. Women shrieked, men overturned tables. The king of New York architecture lay dead at the feet of a jealous, deranged, but monumentally wealthy Pittsburgh rival, and the entire high society, low morality drama had played out in front of hundreds of witnesses. Evelyn Nesbit, the girl whose face had launched 1,000 ships and now 1,000 scandals, simply stood frozen, her eyes wide with a terror that would define the rest of her long, troubled life. The trial of the century: wealth, madness, and morality. The aftermath was a media frenzy unlike anything the young nation had ever seen. Newspapers, the mass media of the day, fueled by the new technology of the rotary press and the hunger for sensation,
this was more than just a
dubbed
murder.
it the
It
trial
was
of
a
the
societal
century.
autopsy. The proceedings, held in New York, became a grand spectacle, a clash between old morality versus Gilded Age decadence. New York's elite defending White's legacy but ignoring his lifestyle versus Thaw's vast fortune, which paid for the most formidable defense team in the country. The key legal strategy employed by Thaw's defense was dementia americana, a plea that Harry Thaw, a wealthy man whose honor had been insulted, was driven temporarily insane by White's abduction and corruption of his young wife. The facts unveiled in court. The architect's secret life. The trial forced the exposure of Stanford White's Red Room and his long-running history of relationships with young chorus girls. This revealed the astonishing hypocrisy of a social order that simultaneously built magnificent churches and maintained secret vice apartments. The jury and the nation recoiled at the details of the velvet swing and the champagne-fueled seduction. The power of money. Thaw's mother, a formidable matriarch, spared no expense. His defense team argued that White was the true villain, the unspeakable beast who had preyed on an innocent girl. They reframed the murder not as a crime of jealousy, but as an act of moral justice, a noble defense of domestic virtue. Evelyn's star turn, Evelyn Nesbit, was forced onto the stand, a fragile 20-something woman recounting the darkest, most traumatic experiences of her teen years. Her testimony, vivid and often heartbreaking, served as the emotional core of the prosecution's case against White's character, even as the prosecution tried to secure a conviction for Thaw. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second trial, held a year later, saw the defense double down on the insanity plea. This time, the jury sided with the dementia americana argument, finding Thaw not guilty by reason of insanity. He was committed to a state asylum. The aftermath and the end of innocence. The verdict sent shockwaves through America. The message was unmistakable. If you were rich enough, you could literally buy an insanity plea for murder by citing the corrupting influence of your victim.
The trial was the first time that the curtain had been ripped away from the Gilded Age elite, revealing the moral rot and the staggering disparities between the fortunes of the few and the crushing lives of the rest. Harry Thaw spent only a few years in a comfortable asylum before his wealth and legal team secured his release. He died in 1947, having lived most of his life as a free man, famous only for the murder he committed. Evelyn Nisbet was scarred for life. She divorced Thaw, attempted to launch a career in silent films, and eventually descended into a troubled existence marked by poverty, alcoholism, and a failed attempt at a memoir. She died in 1967, forever remembered as the girl who was the catalyst for the crime of the century. Stanford White's legacy remains complex. His buildings still stand, monuments to his genius, but the shadow of the Red Room scandal ensures that his name is forever linked to the era's darkest hypocrisy. The crime of the century was more than a newspaper sensation. It was a watershed moment. It marked the cultural end of the Gilded Age, shattering the illusion of a virtuous American aristocracy and introducing a new era of celebrity obsession and tabloid justice. The trial was a chilling preview of how wealth and scandal would forever intertwine on the national stage, forever altering the American understanding of fame, morality, and justice.
It was a true story, a triangle of architect, siren, and madman. So unbelievable, so fact-rich in its exposure of social history that no fiction could ever match its astonishing reality.